Hello, and welcome to the third video for Music History Graduate Review Course MUHL 5300. This video is primarily dedicated to Baroque sacred music. As with all the other videos, remember to go ahead and read in your textbook. Chapter 15 is particularly pertinent to this material. And then also print out your scores or keep them handy while you're viewing the lecture material. And finally, make sure that you also ideally have another browser window up with the Spotify list for all of the pieces that are in this unit, in this Baroque unit, so that you can listen to those pieces, stop the video when you want to, listen to a work, and then go back into the video. So, early sacred music in the Baroque period, starting around the 1580s, is, of course, affected by Counter-Reformation aesthetics. And so one of the things, or one of the first things that develops with sacred music and instrumental music as well in this period is an emphasis on this idea of the concerted style. If you've ever heard someone say it was a concerted effort, this is the same use of the term. And so we're not talking about concertos here. We're talking about the idea of instruments and voices, dissimilar forces coming together to create a concerted effort. And this is a radical idea for the period because, as you remember, in the Renaissance, we had some intermingling of voices and instruments, but the instruments were usually just supporting or accompanying the voice. Here, the concerted style means that both forces are adding in an equal way to the resultant sound, and that's just a really new and important idea for the period. Giovanni Gabrieli in Venice is one of the first to really employ this style in his pieces. And part of the reason for this is because he worked in one of the most impressive workspaces of the period in St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. And so if you've ever been to Venice, you've probably seen this space. I'm going to switch over here. On top, of course, is the outside, just an incredible building. You can see the top view there on the lower left, and on the lower right you can see an interior shot. And so notice all of these little crevices, these chapels, these extra spaces that Gabrieli had at his disposal, and so he uses them. He puts choir 1 in one area of the church, choir 2 in another area, has some instrument choirs scattered around the space, as well as having one or I think actually 2 organs. So there's quite a bit of space to fill here, but if you strategically move your choirs around and create this sort of cori spezzati effect, then you get a lovely dramatic effect around the building with the voices bouncing off of the different spaces. Here's Gabrieli's biography. We know that he studied with his uncle Andrea Gabrieli originally, and in the 1570s he's in Munich, but by 1584 he's already become an organist at St. Mark's in Venice, and throughout the rest of his life he publishes and teaches and has many, many students while he works at St. Mark's, and this is really his legacy to us. I mean, some amazing pieces, of course, but this legacy of having taught very many students from all over Europe at that time, and a kind of passing on of this Venetian style throughout Europe. His work in Ecclesies doesn't really fit in any exact genre. It was written for a procession, and it is a very beautifully concerted piece where we have these verses, these soloists, as you see at the bottom. We start with a soprano, we have a refrain, a bass, and then a refrain. Then we have an instrumental interlude in the middle, and then we have these duo voices coming in, the alto and the tenor, the soprano and the bass. Another refrain, and then everyone all together. So this beautiful work has a symmetric shape to it. but it very much is a pioneering work for the day. Please go ahead and stop the video here and go over to your Spotify list so you can hear it. Now, Monteverdi, who we talked about in our last video, is still present in the sacred music of the day, as many of you probably know. One of his most important pieces in this vein is the 1610 Vespers, which he wrote actually before he left Mantua. This was a piece that we believe he used it as a resume piece actually, and sent it to the church in Venice as an example of his abilities. And so, what we have in the Vespers is both his prima practica writing as well as his secunda practica writing. He wants to show that he can do all of these things. He's not just the composer of Orfeo or Ariadne, both of which were very famous by this time, um, but also I can do this older style. And he wanted to also maybe erase some of the criticisms by people like Artusi that may have still been floating around in people's minds. So you don't have to stop the video here, but you can go to the video section of the Baroque unit, and I have linked a video of a performance of Duo Seraphim there. Let's go on to the German sacred, and particularly on to the chorale cantata. Now, before we get to Bach, let's talk about Heinrich Schütz. His dates are there, and as we see, he studied actually with both Gabrieli and Monteverdi in Venice. He wrote numerous sacred works as well as secular works. Unfortunately, his secular works were destroyed, we believe, during the 30 Years' War. None of them have yet really come to light. So we know that he was putting together in a Venetian style Germanic pieces that were large scale sacred works. And an example is in your Spotify listening list, Saul, was verfolgst du mich? You can go ahead and stop the video here and listen. Notice as you do, though, how similar it is to what you've heard so far of the Venetian style. The only difference, of course, is that now it's in German. Johann Sebastian Bach is, of course, one of the most important figures in later Baroque sacred music. We know that he wrote about 280 sacred cantatas during his active years. Only about 200 survive. Um, we also know that he started his career quite early in life in Leipzig. This is not unusual for the day. And we also know that he was quite competent working with a variety of instrumental and vocal forces throughout his pieces. Um, his piece Jesu der du meine Ziele is Chorale Cantata BWV 78, and it mentions here just a few things in the opening movement that you should listen for, including an ostinato bass. All right, remember that this is a repeating bass line. And then we also have this ritornello structure. Uh, this is borrowed from the later Renaissance, but it's still something that's quite active and used and useful during the Baroque. The chorale, the actual Lutheran chorale, is woven throughout the work, but is particularly evident during the chorale, large chorale fantasia, as well as during its direct pronouncement, usually either at the very beginning or the very end of the chorale cantata. And then, as with the earlier cantata form that we talked about back with Barbara Strozzi, we still have this alternation, this contrasting alternation of styles, sometimes aria, sometimes recitative, but also alternating affects. So please go ahead and stop the video here and go listen to Jesu der du meine Ziele. Moving on to the French sacred. One of our most important figures is Charpentier, and so we will look at his Te Deum. Unlike the Italians, French composers were working primarily for the king, in this case, Louis XIV of France. And so almost all of our larger sacred pieces of the period seem to be not only dedicated to him, but have a certain panegyric quality to them. This work is believed to have been written for the French victory at Steinkirke on August 3rd, 1692. So not only is it a sacred work, but it has a political element to it as well, which again is not unusual for the period. Here is a brief schematic, if you will, of the work where we start with a prelude with trumpets and drums. Again, this is a military work, so clearly, even though it is a sacred work, we're bringing in the instruments because we're thanking God for our military victory. And so we have, again, a sense of this concerted style that we talked about earlier because the instruments aren't just there to accompany, really. They're providing their own qualities to make this piece sound the way it does. Here's the whole text for you, and it's probably good to go ahead and stop the video at this time and go and listen to the work. As was mentioned earlier with the political reverberations of this work, Charpentier, of course, emphasizes the idea that France has God's support, that heaven wanted France to win. And we see that repeated a lot in the music of this period, and even all the way up through into the 19th century, really. Moving on to the Italian and English sacred, to the oratorio. Oratorios, as you recall, are unstaged sacred pieces. So it's basically an opera. It includes all the elements of opera, arias, recitatives, choruses, and usually tells a story. This is a sacred story, usually taken from the Bible, sometimes from the Apocrypha. And these are performed often most actively during the Lent period when opera houses were generally closed. These were not performed in churches, but usually in extra buildings, maybe a parish hall connected to the church, or even to in public concert halls. So this is a style that begins in Italy, but then spreads out over the continent, particularly to England. Giacomo Carissimi's piece Jephtha has this, has the plot listed here. Jephthah pledges to God that if he wins the battle, that upon his homecoming, the very first thing he sees, whether it be a chicken or a dog or whatever, he will sacrifice it to God for thanks. Unfortunately, when he comes home, the first thing that he is approached by is his daughter. And so this creates a great deal of grieving and melancholy throughout the rest of the piece from that moment on. Um, we've set up here for you to listen to the bass solo Fugite, and notice as you're listening to it, this is where Handel gets this Handelian oratorio style. Um, he hears it earlier from Carissimi and others, and notice this imitative quality that we tend to associate with later Baroque oratorios. Handel, of course, begins his musical career in Germany, but goes to study in Italy. And this is very important to his style and his career. And when he's in Italy, he learns not only the operatic style, which leads him to be one of the most important composers of opera seria, but also the oratorio, which was popular in Italy at the time. So when he moves to England, originally around 1710, he first starts doing opera seria, but this proves to be less financially stable for him. And so after a couple of years there, really, he switches over and starts writing primarily oratorios. One of the most famous, of course, being the Messiah, and within that, of course, the Hallelujah Chorus. Here is a announcement that was posted for the performance of the Messiah when it was produced at the Theatre Royal in Covent Gardens. So notice again, it's not being performed in a church. This is one of the ways that oratorio is quite different from a cantata or a chorale cantata, which were performed in church. Oratorios, they sold tickets to these things. They were produced sometimes again within maybe a larger church compound, but usually never performed during a church service. So that brings us to the end of this third video encompassing Baroque sacred music. Please remember to go to your textbook, read through the pertinent chapters, as well as going to the Total Access site at WW Norton. Please find the address there in the middle of the page. And of course, you will find there many outlines, flashcards, and review quizzes, along with other material that will help you study for this exam.